We're going to continue our discussion of purity laws this morning and bring our study of Leviticus to a conclusion in our next session. I just want to thank all of you for your openness and your willingness to consider these things with me. These have been some pretty deep and difficult concepts, but you've been very receptive to them. I've been very encouraged by your responses and by the kinds of discussions that our classes have generated in the evenings. So I want to thank you for your good participation and making me feel so welcome and your receptivity to the things that I've been sharing. I want to begin this morning by sharing with you a letter that I came across on the internet one time that was addressed to a well-known radio personality in America named Dr. Laura Schlesinger. Have any of you ever heard of Dr. Laura? She usually just goes by Dr. Laura. Anybody? Okay, she's not, you've heard of her. Okay. She's obviously not well known over here. Dr. Laura Schlesinger is a conservative talk radio host. She is Jewish. She originally was Methodist, but she married a Jewish man and converted to Judaism when she married. And so she has a strong Judeo-Christian ethic. And she has written a number of books, all of which have centered around making good moral choices, making good moral decisions. So she has a talk radio show in which people call in and ask her for moral advice. So you've heard of Dear Abby? You've heard, okay, Dr. Laura is a little bit like Dear Abby, but it's more like Dear Abby with an attitude. Because she's pretty straightforward. She would go well in Australia. She doesn't sugarcoat anything, right? She's just, she's very, very direct. But her radio show became quite popular, especially among people who share that same conservative orientation. And so she's not afraid to take on the controversial issues. And so she'll just tell people what she thinks about, abortion or about same-sex marriage or about those kinds of issues, which currently, at least where I'm from, are very much debated right now. I want to share with you a letter that one of her listeners sent to her because I think it relates so well to how easily we misunderstand the kinds of material that we've been studying in the book of Leviticus. This is a book that Dr. Laura will appeal to from time to time as she addresses certain controversial issues. And I want to show you one listener's reaction to her responses, her ideas about things. See, all right, I'm missing a little bit of it. Let me kind of fill in the gaps for what we have here. This particular listener wrote a letter, and he started out by saying, "Dear Dr. Laura, I listened to your show faithfully, and I want to thank you for clarifying so many moral issues." And this person said, you make the point that, when someone calls in and asks about homosexuality, you say, well, that's an abomination to the Lord, case closed, it's settled. And he goes on to say, since you're an expert in such things, I thought I might ask you about a number of other questions I have regarding God's law. And then he proceeds to go through a series of statements like this, beginning in Leviticus. He says, Leviticus 25:44 states that I may possess slaves, both male and female, provided they are purchased from neighboring nations. A friend of mine claims that this applies to Mexicans, but not Canadians. Can you clarify, why can't I own Canadians? I would like to sell my daughter into slavery as sanctioned in Exodus 21:7. In this day and age, what do you think would be a fair price for her? I know that I am allowed no contact with a woman while she is in her period of menstrual unseemliness, Leviticus 15:19-24. The problem is, how do I tell? I've tried asking, but most women take offense. When I burn a bull on the altar as a sacrifice, I know it creates a pleasing odor for the Lord, Leviticus 1:9. The problem is my neighbors. They claim the odor is not pleasing to them. Should I smite them? I have a neighbor who insists on working on the Sabbath. Exodus 35:2 clearly states he should be put to death. Am I morally obligated to kill him myself, or should I ask the police to do it? A friend of mine feels that even though eating shellfish is an abomination, Leviticus 11:10, it is a lesser abomination than homosexuality. I don't agree. Can you settle this? Are there degrees of abomination? Leviticus 21:20 states that I may not approach the altar of God if I have a defect in my sight. I have to admit that I wear reading glasses. Does my vision have to be 20/20, or is there some wiggle room here? Most of my male friends get their hair trimmed, including the hair around their temples, even though this is expressly forbidden by Leviticus 19:27. How should they die? I know from Leviticus 11:6-8 that touching the skin of a dead pig makes me unclean, but may I still play football if I wear gloves? You know, that's brilliant. That's the answer. Latex gloves. Right? My uncle has a farm. He violates Leviticus 19:19 by planting 2 different crops in the same field, as does his wife, by wearing garments made of 2 different kinds of thread, cotton, polyester blend. He also tends to curse and blaspheme a lot. Is it really necessary that we go to all the trouble of getting the whole town together to stone them? Leviticus 24:10-16. Couldn't we just burn them at a death at a private family affair like we do with people who sleep with their in-laws? Leviticus 20:14. I know you have studied these things extensively and thus enjoy considerable expertise in such matters, so I am confident you can help. Thank you again for reminding us that God's Word is eternal and unchanging. Your adoring fan, James M. Kaufman, EDD, Professor Emeritus, and so forth. I think you can tell that this letter was written with tongue-in-cheek. This is clearly someone who disagrees with Dr. Laura about her stance on these things, and particularly objects to the way that she justifies her positions by appealing to Leviticus. But you know, in reality, he makes a very important point. He makes a very good point. You can't just pick and choose which passages from Leviticus apply and which ones don't. That's very inconsistent. It becomes very confusing. And it really runs the risk of making our faith appear to be arbitrary, right? You see, it is precisely objections like the one expressed by this man in what is a very clever and very sarcastic letter. But nonetheless, I think he's making an important point. When we are interpreting the book of Leviticus for Christian practice, we are looking for the underlying principles that motivated these laws, and not the actual application of the laws themselves. Does that make sense? Yeah. And this is what Christ so brilliantly taught us to do, was to see beyond the symbolic manifestation and to grab hold of the underlying principle, and to recognize that the underlying principle remains valid even if the symbolic expression in the law has changed. Does that make sense? And I think perhaps Dr. Laura's rather haphazard application of Levitical laws to contemporary issues left her vulnerable to an objection like this. And I think it's a good warning for us all that as we bear witness to Christ and as we advocate for a holier lifestyle in our world, that we're cautious about the way we do it, that we're careful about the kinds of arguments that we make, that we recognize that unbelievers are coming at these issues from a very different point of view, and that we have to proceed with love and caution and concern as we seek to influence them in a positive direction towards greater intimacy with God and greater purity of life. That's why I wanted to take the time to look at some of these laws with you and help you to understand the logic behind them, so that we can understand the principle without necessarily having to insist upon the symbolic expression. All right? So we're gonna pick up where we left off. Just as way of a little bit of review, at the end of our last session yesterday, We were talking about some of the principles underlying the restrictions that God placed on Israel's diet. There were certain animals that God told Israel were not suitable for eating for her. And we discussed several things. The last thing we talked about was this very interesting situation in which there are two kinds of animals that God prohibited Israel from eating. One kind of animal were predators. So we would be talking about birds of prey, for example. We would be talking about land animals that hunt and that kill other animals and that eat them. And what I suggested to you was that the reason why these predators were unclean for Israel was for probably two reasons. First of all, these are animals that indiscriminately ingested blood. And as we already learned from Leviticus chapter 17, verse 11, God had a very strict restriction on the eating of blood. All right, so we've talked about this a few times. Blood represented life, and life was to be revered in Israel. God revered life, and God wanted his people to revere life. And so blood was to be treated with great respect. And in addition to that, God had set blood apart for the specific purpose of atonement, for the specific purpose of cleansing the sanctuary and Israel, so that God could continue living in their very midst, so that he could continue to commune with them in intimacy. So blood was off limits. No blood pudding for Israel. Right? No eating of meat in which the blood had not been drained. And so naturally, when you talk about animals such as these that eat the food and ingest the blood directly, eating that animal is essentially the same as ingesting the blood. You see what I'm saying? So it's not too hard to see why those animals were unclean. But there's a second reason why I think God prohibited Israel from eating these animals. Have you ever heard the expression, you are what you eat? Yeah, we use that a lot in America. We say that sometimes, you are what you eat. Well, this is taking that to a whole new level. God took that very seriously. You are what you eat. And what his point, I think, was this. These animals have a predatory way of life. They prey on the weak. And that is a disposition, that is a way of relating to others that God did not want to encourage in Israel. Do you understand? God wanted Israel to avoid any kind of lifestyle that remotely resembled predation, predatorial behavior towards those that are weaker, those that are easily taken advantage of. So the overall concern here is that God symbolized in Israel's diet his insistence that she avoid at all costs any form of oppression, any form of taking advantage of those who were weak or marginalized or incapable of fending for themselves. You see? So there's a very strong ethical impulse that is symbolized in these prohibitions against certain foods. And that's kind of where we left things off last time when we were looking at this. But then there's another kind of animal that God also declared to be off limits. And this one is a little harder to explain. There are animals like the mole rat, for example. Mole rats they're not predatory. Mole rats don't eat any other animals, right? So what is it about the mole rat that makes it unclean? It's a scurrier, and we know that all scurriers are unclean, but this is the reason why. It's not that the mole rat is detestable or that the mole rat is evil or anything like that. It's that the mole rat is vulnerable. The mole rat is easy prey. And God prohibits Israel from ever taking advantage of a creature or a person who is disadvantaged. You understand? So these are the two kinds of animals. Predators, for obvious reasons that we've just discussed, but also animals that are prey, animals that are disadvantaged in their environment and are therefore easy prey. It's not a fair fight. And what God hoped to teach Israel through this diet was to recognize the need to watch out for the poor and to protect those that are disadvantaged in society and that are particularly susceptible to oppression and being taken advantage of. You may recall that throughout the Old Testament there are repeated warnings to make sure that the widow and the orphan are taken care of in Israel, right? And the New Testament echoes that for the church as well, right? Widows and orphans, those are two categories of people that are particularly susceptible to oppression. They don't have a lot of recourses. They don't have the protection of a father or a husband. And so they are exposed in society. Who's going to watch out for them? Who is going to make sure that they receive justice and that their needs are met? It becomes the responsibility of the community, according to God, to step in where there is no father or there is no husband, to provide that kind of shelter, to provide that kind of protection, you see. And this is infused into Israelite life in every detail, even to the extent that it's symbolized in their menu. It's symbolized in the diet that God prescribed for them, you see. So that's the point, right? The point is not to restrict us from eating pork. The point is to remind us of how important it is to God that we be the kind of society that rejects predatorial practices and oppressive lifestyles that take advantage of the weak. So these restrictions symbolize Israel's movement toward a just and equitable society. And you can see that there are a number of passages that I think bear this out and that point in the direction of the ideal that God had in mind, not just for Israel, but really for the whole world. And we can see an example of this, for example, in the prophet Isaiah, who shares with us a remarkable, beautiful vision of the kind of world that God is moving everything toward. So we read in Isaiah chapter 11, beginning in verse 6. The wolf shall dwell with the lamb, and the leopard shall lie down with the young goat, and the calf and the lion and the fattened calf together, and a little child shall lead them. The cow and the bear shall graze, their young shall lie down together. And the lion shall eat straw like the ox. The nursing child shall play over the hole of the cobra, and the weaned child shall put his hand on the adder's den. They shall not hurt or destroy in all my holy mountain, for the earth shall be full of the knowledge of Yahweh as the waters cover the sea. What a remarkable vision of a renewed nature. Can you imagine a world in which the lion and the ox lie down together, in which the wolf and the lamb dwell together, in which the lion eats straw like the ox and the bear grazes like the cow? You see, what Isaiah is envisioning is a world in which there is no such thing as a predator-prey relationship anymore. Now, what exactly does that mean? How is God going to work that out? I don't know. But it sure is a beautiful picture, isn't it? Whatever it is God means by that, and however it is He plans to work that out, it seems clear that the direction in which God is moving His people, the direction in which He is moving the world, is in the direction of the cessation of all hostilities. Right? The end of all the conflict and the bloodshed and the loss of life that has been such a dark mark, such a blemish on human history. Now, I'm quite open to the possibility that in the new creation that God is bringing, that these animals that we know on this side of things as predatorial, on that other side may not be at all. Maybe God will remake the lion so that he can eat grass instead of meat. I don't know. I think that's a distinct possibility. I'm open to that. I would enjoy that. maybe this is all just symbolic, and it's just meant to be a picture of just how peaceful and harmonious heaven will be. I don't know. I'm open to either possibility. I look forward to finding out, don't you? I look forward to finding out. But until we get there, what God wants us to do is to begin living this kind of lifestyle in anticipation of that future. Does that make sense? We are all ready to begin living that future now, so that the world can see the direction in which God is moving everything, and they will want to join us in anticipating a reality like that. And there are other passages that give similar expression to this vision that God has. But this is what he has in mind when he makes rules that seem to us very strange, very bizarre, very hard to understand. Why is he making these restrictions? This is the reason why. It's a way of infusing into Israel's everyday life, everyday practices, these little reminders, these little symbolic reminders. This is the kind of people you are to be, because this is the kind of God I am. I am a God who values life. I am a God that brings conflict to an end. Now, yes, in this world, sometimes God has to engage in violence himself in order to move us in that direction, and God will do that if that's what it takes. Because that results in less bloodshed than there would be if he simply let us go on our own, right? So that's the point of the unclean animals. Now, there are other things in ancient Israel that could result in defilement besides animals. And so when we leave Leviticus chapter 11, we enter into a realm where there are other things that Israel had to be conscious of that were potentially defiling. So let's talk about some other cases of ritual defilement and see if we can understand some of the reasons behind their defiling nature. When we get into Leviticus chapter 12, we discover that even something quite natural as childbirth has the potential of defiling. Actually, childbirth is always defiling. And you may wonder why. This is a joyous occasion. The birth of a child certainly is a good thing. It represents life, and it's a perfectly natural event. Why would God say that there is impurity associated with childbirth, which requires purification? Well, let's remember for a second. Remember when we first started talking about these purity laws, I said that there were about 3 things you wanted to keep in mind that together form a rationale for these. One was the created order, the ideal created order. Things that conform more to that ideal created order are clean, and things that do not conform to that ideal created order are not clean. The second thing we said, which is somewhat related to that, is the fall. Anything that is somehow related to the fall of Adam and Eve in Genesis 3 and the curse that came from that is defiling. And then the third thing was the prohibition of blood, right? God's prohibition against blood. These 3 things operate together to provide kind of the rationale for purity and impurity. This brings us back to the issue of childbirth. Remember that when God addressed Eve's sin, one of the consequences of her sin that he described was what? I will greatly multiply your pain in childbearing. So childbearing is one of those areas that bears a particular evidence of the fall. It demonstrates a consequence of Eve's sin. And that's the reason why there is defilement attached to it, because it's something that has been tainted by the fall. God's intention apparently initially was that childbirth not be so deadly to the woman, not be so painful for her, but something in the introduction of sin into the world changed things and made it such that the woman's role in bringing life into this world is greatly complicated. Complicated, in fact, so much that it brings her very close to death and that it involves a great deal of pain. Now, I can only speak to that as a second-hand observer, so I will leave it to the women to amen that statement. But my wife has assured me that it is true. So that's the reason why childbirth is included within these things. It's a reminder to Israel, yes, this is a joyous occasion. Yes, we ought to be thankful for the new life that God brings by this means, but we also ought to remember that sin has tainted this and has deprived it of some of its joy. And you need to remember that, because by remembering that, you'll remember that you want to avoid sin from now on. You want to eliminate sin from your life, because sin always has the effect of tainting good things and of draining them of some of their joy. And if you want to experience unmitigated joy, then the answer is to purge sin from your life and to avoid it. Isn't that right? It makes it, so this is what God is trying to communicate to Israel by these means. Now, another thing that we notice when we move into Leviticus chapters 13 and 14 is that skin diseases rendered a person unclean. Now, most of our English translations will call this leprosy. Right? You've probably noticed that. How many of your English Bibles say leprosy when you come to chapter 13 and 14? They call these, it's like pretty much leprosy. Anybody have that?
Contagious skin disease.
That's better. Yeah, that's good. Contagious skin disease is good, although I'm not sure it's contagious. Contagious may be saying a bit too much. But skin disease is a good rendering for it. This is not leprosy as we think of it. The leprosy that we know of today is called Hansen's disease, right? And it's an extremely debilitating and grotesque form of disease. It's terrible. What I want you to realize is that's not what Leviticus is talking about. Leviticus is not talking about leprosy of that kind, not of the modern kind, not the kind that Mother Teresa is famous for having ministered to and treated. Those are not the kinds of lepers we're talking about here. This is referring to various kinds of skin disease that result in discoloration of the skin on the human body. So that's what we're talking about. Now, so it could be something, like psoriasis, I suppose, right? So it could be something like that. It could be something really relatively minor. But the problem is that it lent to the skin this pallor of death. It was a section of dead skin. And the problem with that was a mixing of death with life. And those were two things that should not be mixed together. Do you understand? Death and life were two things that God did not want mixed together. Death belonged at one end of the pole of the spectrum, and life belonged at the other. And Israel was to always gravitate in the direction of life. So this mix of dead skin with live skin that was apparent on the body rendered the person unclean. Now, of course, we know today, with our modern scientific understanding, that we've always got dead skin on us, right? We've always got dead skin cells on us. That's unavoidable. But, of course, Israel didn't understand that. Israel could only relate to what she could see. And so only when it was visible that there was a discoloration did it become an issue. And that's when the priest would come in and would identify the person as being clean or unclean and so forth. So that was what rendered a person with skin disease unclean and necessitated the kinds of precautions that were observed in these rituals. So once again, it has to do with this whole idea of gravitating towards life and away from death, the association of death with the first sin of Adam and Eve and with the fall. All of that factors into these kinds of things. Now, the very interesting thing about Leviticus 13 and 14 is that this whole issue of skin disease is not restricted to human beings. The same word that is used to describe skin diseases that render a person unclean are also applied to buildings, to houses. Houses could be declared unclean by virtue of the fact that they had discoloration in the wall, right? Now, this is surely talking about some kind of a fungus or mildew, right? This is an issue where moisture has entered into the home where it doesn't belong and has created spores that creates the discoloration of the wall. And in such a case, a priest would have to be called in and he would have to investigate and see, is the house clean or unclean? And that all seems very odd to us. But once again, this has to do with the way God was encouraging Israel to move in the direction of his creation ideal. This has to do with the way Israel viewed God's creation. And let me just show you what I mean here. That there's a few things that you want to keep in mind. The problem with these homes has to do with the fact that the roof of this house is not keeping water out the way it ought to. And that became symbolic of something that was very evident in creation. Now, I want to share with you a couple of passages from Proverbs that bear this out. And I want to ask for a little help from the audience this morning. I want to see, is there someone over here on this side of the room that would be willing to look up Proverbs chapter 3, verses 19 through 20 and read it for us in just a minute? Is there someone over here who could do that? Who'll be my reader from over here? All right. Lynn is going to do it for us over here. So he's got Proverbs 3, 19 through 20. Now, would someone on this side of the room be willing to look up Proverbs 24, 3 through 4 and read that for us? All right. We've got it right here. Good. So we've got our two readers. So we're good. So Lynn over here and Warren. Right, Warren? Tony. Sorry, you're Warren. Tony. Tony over here. So, all right. Everyone listen carefully to Lynn as he reads Proverbs 3, 19 through 20. And then when he's done, I'll just point out a few things, and then we'll have Tony read Proverbs 24, 3 through 4. And I want you to listen for some very similar language, some very similar words that the two passages use. Okay, Lynn, if you would, please.
The Lord by wisdom founded the earth, and by understanding he established the heavens, and by his knowledge the deeps broke forth, and the clouds dropped down the view. Okay, so this passage is describing the way God created the world. And it says there were three tools that were primary in God's use. It was wisdom, understanding, and what was the third one, Lynn? Knowledge. Wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. By wisdom, understanding, and knowledge, God shaped the world and formed it and instilled it with order. All right. Now, Tony, if you would please read Proverbs 24, 3 through 4.
By wisdom a house is built, and through understanding it is established. Through knowledge its rooms are filled with rare and beautiful treasures.
You hear that? The same three tools that God used to build the cosmos are the same three tools that a person uses to build a house or a household. You know what that means? The construction of a house is an imitation of God's construction of the world. A house is a symbol of creation. Now, from Israel's point of view, let me show you the way Israel viewed the world, because it's quite different from the way we viewed the world. This is a picture of the way Israel and the rest of the ancient Near East, how they viewed the world. You'll notice that water completely surrounds the world. In Israel's point of view, the world is just floating in a cosmic sea. Right? And the reason, it's not hard to see why they thought this. Water came down from above, and they wondered why. They said, there must be water up there, right? I mean, boy, we know that here, don't we? We've been experiencing this on a regular basis. Water has been coming down from above on quite a regular basis, sometimes quite aggressively, right? And so Israel figured, and the rest of the ancient world did too, well, there must be water up there. So they understood that there were waters. And what God did is God put a roof on the world that held the water back. Now, in this roof had little, skylights, I guess you could say. You see these little gates here, and here. They're called floodgates. God can open those when he wants to let water in. And then he can close them when he doesn't, right? And this is how they understood the rain. They understood the rain. And God was fine with that. He said, okay, yeah, something like that's what happens, yeah. Right, yeah. So in the creation story, God talks about this dome that he created, right? So they understood the sky to be solid, not gassy, not ethereal, but solid. Now, you've heard of the flood, right? You know what happened when the flood occurred? God took the roof off, and all the waters just went, whoosh, you see. That's the way the flood is described. It was a removal of that roof, And the waters above and the waters below just collapsed and returned creation back to the state it was in Genesis 1 verse 2. Just a chaotic mass of water. So the flood was literally an act of uncreation. Okay, so this is the way Israel viewed the world. Now, this roof had better work. This roof had better not leak. Because if it leaks, we have a problem, right? If water comes in when it's not supposed to, and if it goes where it's not supposed to, that is defying a creation boundary, and it is encouraging disorder in God's world, right? And we know this to be true. Floods are a challenge to God's created order. God did not intend for such things to happen. And in the world as God had originally created it, supposedly such things wouldn't happen. But since sin has entered the world and the entire cosmos has been thrown out of whack as a result, things don't always operate in the world as they're supposed to. And so we get things like natural disasters and such because sin just has that kind of effect on the whole system. So when a home leaks, when a home has evidence of moisture coming in when it shouldn't, that becomes symbolic of a world that isn't functioning precisely as it should and that is in need of God's repair, right? And for that reason, it becomes unclean. So you see how God is trying to use all these symbols to orient Israel towards the idea of moving back in the direction of God's creational ideal. All right, so that's what stands behind that.
Fungus also can be deadly too, though.
Yes.
So cleaning that out is also a healthy.
Yes. Yeah, there is a health benefit to it. Now, this would have been the case with any mold, mildew, or fungus, regardless of whether it was lethal or not. So the symbolism is primary, but yes, a good side effect, a good side benefit of it was the fact that it did prevent perhaps threats to the well-being of the inhabitants of the house.
I was thinking the same about the skin disorder because with leprosy, like if you just make all skin disorder unclean, it does also protect a bit because it eventually becomes leprosy.
Yes, yeah, it can certainly have that effect. That's right. Yeah, so yes, you can have some health benefits that accrue as a result of the symbolism. But primarily, I think God is mainly wanting to communicate this idea of the ideal order and moving back in that direction. And of course, if we live that way, there will be health benefits to that. Absolutely, yeah. And so that's one of many things that proves to be a salient benefit of doing things God's way and of appreciating God's order. Anytime we try to live in this world in a manner that ignores the boundaries that God has set up in the world, we threaten our own lives or our own health or the health of others. And we've seen that in any number of cases, haven't we? And kind of living carelessly and thoughtlessly in God's world as though we could do with it as we please. But that has some pretty serious consequences on the whole global community. And I think one thing that God is seeking to do among his people is to raise awareness that we live in a sensitive network of relationships, both with him and with our fellow human beings. And that if we don't take seriously these creational boundaries that he's put in place, we are destabilizing that whole network. And that brings harm to us, it brings harm to others, and it creates distance between ourselves and God. So yeah, all of this goes together to make precisely those kinds of points. Bodily discharges are next. I was hoping we'd run out of time before getting to this, but alas, I have been too efficient and moved too quickly, and so now I am left with no choice but have to talk about bodily discharges. I don't really mind that much, but once again, we're talking about something here that's natural, not really something to be ashamed of. Our bodies function in these ways. And these, of course, are discharges related to the reproductive organs of men and women. And so whether we're talking about the normal cycle of menstruation in a woman, or whether we're talking about nocturnal emissions in a man, we're talking about a loss of bodily fluid that in Israel symbolized a loss of life, and thus a gravitation in the direction of death. So the point here seems to be unrealized potential life. Now, in the case of menstruation, there are two things going on that contribute to the impurity associated with it. And once again, remember that impurity doesn't mean that God considers this to be gross or that he considers it to be evil. It's merely something that he wants Israel to remember has close associations with life and death and the need to distinguish between the two. In the case of menstruation, there is, of course, a loss of blood, and anytime blood is shed, there are issues of purity that arise, right? But the second thing is that any time a woman goes through her cycle, clearly there was a lost opportunity for life. The potential for life wasn't realized in that particular cycle, in that particular month. And so Israel took that very seriously and said, well, there was an opportunity for life that was lost. No one can help it. It's not a sin, but it is defiling. You see? Quickly get away from that to the next thing. Nocturnal emissions for the male is kind of the corollary to that for the female. When a man has nocturnal emissions, once again, it's the loss of potential life. The semen that God has given to men is intended for procreation. It's intended for the advance of life. When it is emitted and doesn't realize that goal, it's a loss of potential life, and therefore it's defiling. Now, one thing I think you can sense here is that there's an extremely strong pro-life ethic being advanced here by God in Israel, right? I know I personally have at times thought my Catholic friends a little bit odd with just how extreme they are in terms of their caution with regard to procreation. But the more I've read Leviticus and the more I feel like I've come to understand what God is doing with this, the more I realize there may be something to that. And I've found myself gravitating a little bit more in their direction on this issue because they are so consistently pro-life, right? They oppose capital punishment for that strong sense that that's life, that's sacred, that's not for a human, whether the government or others to take, whatever. And while I may not be precisely where they are on issues like that, I find myself really drawn and really attracted to that consistent and strong pro-life position. And I think it is consistent with the kind of message that we see coming from these kinds of things in Leviticus. Now, one thing that does seem odd is that even normal sexual relations between a husband and a wife also renders both unclean for a certain period of time and requires a purification ritual. And once again, this is not because God has any objection whatsoever to sexual intercourse between a husband and a wife. That's his idea, it's his invention. But once again, each time this happens, there is an excess of bodily fluids that don't go towards the procreation of life, and that excess is once again a loss of potential life, right? And as a result, that is also something that renders them unclean. All of this is designed to communicate to Israel the strong need to respect the powerful nature of our reproductive organs and sexual relationships. These are very powerful human urges. These are very powerful bodily fluids that God uses to procreate life. And they are to be respected. This is not for mere recreation, in other words, you see. And of course, sex is enjoyable, and God intends for us to enjoy it, but at the same time, he wants us to remember that it serves a very serious and important purpose in his created order. And it is to be enjoyed within the limits of that created order. And when it isn't, it multiplies death. It moves us in the direction of chaos and death instead of in the direction of life and order. Okay? So all of these laws, all of these restrictions regarding how Israel practiced reproduction and her sexual activity were intended to communicate to Israel, this is powerful stuff. You need to be careful with your sexuality. Now, what do you think about communicating a message like that in our culture? sex is a powerful thing, you need to be careful with it. You need to be deliberate about disciplining your sexual urges and respecting the boundaries that God has placed around it, because they're for your own good. God's not trying to diminish your enjoyment of sex. He's actually trying to increase it by removing the dangerous elements that pertain to it when it is used indiscriminately, right? And we see it all the time, how easily we abuse our sexuality when we force it on others or when we take advantage of the weak in a sexual way. And it's happening a lot. And it all has to do with the fact that we've become entirely too careless with something that is extremely powerful and potent. And it's a good thing, and it serves a purpose in God's creation, but we've used it for all other kinds of things, and as a result, we've wreaked havoc. Now, what I want to do now is kind of give you a picture of how all of this comes together to create a large concept for Israel in terms of her life, and how she maps out her life in God's world. And I want to show you that there is a kind of axis. There are two axes, actually, on which we can plot just about any purity law. One axis, which we're going to use as our vertical axis, is about conformity to God's order versus non-conformity to God's order. So this is one axis that defines purity in Israel. Those things that conform to God's order are clean. Those things that do not conform to God's order are not clean. And the passage that gives us the rationale for this is Genesis chapter 1, where we see the ideal order for creation spelled out. The other axis is the axis of life and death. Those things that gravitate in the direction of life, that promote life, that extend life, are clean. Those things that gravitate in the direction of death are unclean. And the passage that gives us the rationale for this is Genesis chapter 9. Now you'll recognize that Genesis chapter 9 is a passage where God speaks to Noah after the flood. And he makes some important points about the changes that will occur in creation as a result of what has just happened. And if you'll look with me, you'll see that there are a number of things that God points out. Beginning in verse 1 of chapter 9, it says, "And God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth. The fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth, and upon every bird of the heavens, and upon everything that creeps on the ground, and all the fish of the sea. Into your hand they are delivered. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you." Now that's a change, isn't it? From Genesis 1. "And as I gave you the green plants, I give you everything. But you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is its blood." See, so already in Genesis 9, God is placing a restriction not only on Israel, because this is before Israel, right? This restriction of blood extended beyond Israel. By the way, I might point this out. When we go to Acts chapter 15, and the apostles have gathered together to deal with certain controversies that have arisen between the Jews and the Gentiles, there are three things that they basically ask the Gentiles to abstain from in order to encourage good relations with their Jewish brethren. And one of them is avoid eating blood. That was in the church. That was under the new covenant, right? For the purposes of unity, observe this Noachic prohibition against blood. That's interesting, isn't it?
Was that in the transitional time when Judaism was, when there were a lot of Jews in the church?
Perhaps. The apostles laid it out as these are the basic things that we asked you Gentiles to observe so that you can have table fellowship with the Jews. Yeah. But it's interesting that it seems to be influenced by this. So he says, you shall not eat with its life, that is its blood, any flesh, any meat. And for your lifeblood I will require a reckoning from every beast, I will require it, and from man. From his fellow man I will require a reckoning for the life of man. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. For God made man in his own image. So there's that strong sense that you are to gravitate towards life and away from death. And so Genesis 9 gives us this rationale that runs across the other way, life and death. Now, that gives us a sense that there are these two quadrants that are most important for Israel. Holiness would be in the quadrant that is formed by the pole of life and the pole of conformity to God's order. These are the two virtues that promote holiness. Do you see that? Now, the quadrant that Israel is to avoid is the opposite quadrant. It's the quadrant that is formed by the poles of death and nonconformity to God's order, which promotes abomination. So anything that God calls an abomination, he refers to as abomination for the simple reason that it defies his ideal creational order and that it promotes death. All right? So that's a simplistic way of just thinking about all the purity laws. Is that helpful? Does that give you a sense of, and that kind of helps you to see these are the values that God is attempting to communicate to Israel by means of these laws symbolically. Now we get to the really good stuff. When Jesus comes, it's very clear that something has changed in the dynamic of purity and impurity. Because all of a sudden, with the coming of Jesus Christ, a series of anomalies begin to occur in these Levitical prescriptions. And it begins with Mark chapter 7, where Jesus teaches the people a lesson about defilement. Turn there with me and just listen to what he says, because it's fascinating in light of what we've just been studying. We'll begin reading in verse 14. And he called the people to him again and said to them, "Hear me, all of you, and understand. There is nothing outside a person that by going into him can defile him, but the things that come out of a person are what defile him." And when he had entered the house and left the people, his disciples asked him about the parable. I find that interesting. He was teaching this generally to the crowd, but when he was in the house with just his disciples, they said, "What did you mean by that?" Because they're thinking, wait a minute, this could have some real serious implications with regard to what we eat. And he said to them, "Then are you also without understanding? Do you not see that whatever goes into a person from outside cannot defile him, since it enters not his heart, but his stomach, and is expelled?" Now look at this little parenthetical remark that Mark makes. "Thus he declared all foods clean." With this teaching, Jesus acted as priest, because only a priest can declare something clean, right? In this text, Jesus makes a priestly proclamation, and he says, "I hereby declare all foods clean." Because the reality that those were pointing to is now here, and we can do away with the symbol and enjoy the reality. It was never about being defiled from outside. And he said, what comes out of a person is what defiles him. For from within, out of the heart of a person, come evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, coveting, wickedness, deceit, sensuality, envy, slander, pride, foolishness. All these evil things come from within, and they defile a person. You know, it occurs to me that this is a very radical understanding of evil that is very different from the way I grew up. I grew up being taught that evil is out there, and I've got to retreat from it and hide from it, right? Evil is outside of me, and it comes in through what I watch or through the people that I hang around with, right? And so the problem was that I always perceived evil to be external to me, and that it was always threatening to come in. But Jesus says, actually, that's not how evil works. Evil is already within you, and it comes out. You see. So I was always trying to fight evil by restricting myself from these things and by avoiding those things. Unfortunately, evil arose anyway. And those did not ultimately protect me from evil. Now, of course, I believe there are certain things we ought to avoid seeing and certain things that we ought to avoid doing because they stir the evil within, because they encourage the evil that is already inside. But there is nothing outside of you that can put evil into you. What there is are things outside that provoke an evil that is already inside of us. You see the difference? And so I began to realize that censorship alone was not the answer to my holiness or to the holiness of my children. Now, I think there's a role for censorship. There are certain things that I want to protect my children from, not because I fear that it will instill evil in them, but because I fear that it will provoke the evil that is already there. That the origin of evil is always from within, isn't it? It's from within the human heart. And so ultimately, the answer is to deal with the heart. You see? And so with that teaching, Jesus pointed to what the ultimate goal of the purity system had always been. It had always been about being pure in heart, O God, by means of observing these symbolic rituals. So all foods are clean, Jesus declares. In the new covenant, the reality replaces the symbol. Then we come across a second example of how something has changed. In Mark chapter 1, verses 40 to 45, Jesus encounters a leper. It says, "And a leper came to him, imploring him, and kneeling, said to him, 'If you will, you can make me clean.' Moved with pity, he stretched out his hand and touched him, and said to him, 'I will be clean.' And immediately the leprosy left him, and he was made clean." Now that's remarkable. What did Jesus just do that he shouldn't have done? He touched someone that was unclean, that had one of those skin diseases that was defiling. He touched him. Why did he do that? See, something has happened. And you'll notice this, that when Jesus touched him, Jesus didn't become unclean. What happened instead? The leper became clean. When Jesus came, the direction of defilement was reversed. In Leviticus, the direction of defilement was always that which is unclean will attempt to encroach on and defile that which is clean or that which is holy, right? And so the concern was always to protect what is holy from that which was unclean. But when Jesus comes, the dynamic flips. And now holiness is moving out and is sanctifying everything it touches. So the direction of defilement is changed in Jesus Christ. And instead of a leper defiling him, he cleanses the leper. You'll notice it happens again in Mark chapter 5, verses 21 through 43, when a woman with a perpetual flow of blood is in a crowd as Jesus is making his way to Jairus' house to heal his daughter. Do you remember this? And she thinks to herself, if I could even just touch the hem of his garment, I would be healed, right? And so she touches the hem of his garment, and her blood flow stops. Now that should have defiled Jesus, but it didn't. Instead, the holiness of Christ reached out and sanctified her and purified her of her defilement. The direction of defilement has changed with the coming of Jesus Christ. Holiness is no longer contained in a room that is a cube. Holiness is no longer content to stay behind a curtain, a veil, and to protect itself from our sin. Holiness is now broken out and is confronting our sin and challenging it and overcoming it with sanctity. And then finally, we might look at what Paul says in 2 Corinthians. This raises a question. It says, well, if that's true, in what sense do these prescriptions for purity still inform Christian life, Christian behavior? Is there still a sense in which we are to avoid impurity? And yes, of course there is. And the Apostle Paul tells us how in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, beginning in verse 14, where we see him using this very language of purity and impurity. Paul says here, do not be unequally yoked with unbelievers, for what partnership has righteousness with lawlessness? Or What fellowship has light with darkness? What accord has Christ with Belial, which is just another word for the devil? Or what portion does a believer share with an unbeliever? What agreement has the temple of God with idols? For we are the temple of the living God. As God said, now listen to this, I will make my dwelling among them and walk among them, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. Therefore go out from their midst and be separate from them, says the Lord, and touch no unclean thing, and I will welcome you. I will be a father to you, and you shall be sons and daughters to me, says the Lord Almighty. Notice that Paul uses this language of don't touch the unclean thing. There are still things in this world that are defiling to Christians. Right? It's sin. And we are not to touch that. We are to avoid relationships that encourage us to sin. We are to avoid places that hold temptation for us, right? I got to tell you, when I go to a supermarket, I steer as far away from the magazine rack as I possibly can. My wife has gotten to the point where she'll walk into a grocery store and she'll start turning the magazines over. It embarrasses me to death, like, I don't know this woman. But she feels strongly about this. There are explicit images that are tempting and alluring. They are defiling, right? See, purity now takes on that kind of meaning. We are to avoid those things that tempt us to sin. We are to avoid those things. Remember what Jesus said? If your right eye causes you to sin, what are you to do? Pluck it out, right? And what he really means by that is radically avoid those things that draw you in and excite your sin. So it's not that we are simply free to ignore the principles of ritual purity. It's that the things that defile us have changed. And so now there are different things that we avoid in order to maintain our holiness. Those are the things that tempt us and that try to draw us back in to our previous lives of sin. Well, thank you so much for your kind attention. Let's take a break for morning tea, and then we'll come back and finish up.